Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final day of Metatopia. And today you're watching Improving Collaborative Design. My name is Jonathan Lavallee. I'm a game designer with about 20 years of experience. It always makes me sad whenever I say that. But we have our two fantastic panelists, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves first. Quinn, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Quinn Murphy. I've been doing uh, design both for myself and freelance for, God, has it been like 15 years or so? Like quite some time. I have for a game I've released myself. I have community radio, and I these days I do lots of freelance stuff. I'm doing a lot of stuff for with Paizo for Pathfinder and Starfinder these days, but also been published in stuff like Six City of Blades and um, uh, uh, also a fifth ed thing, Iron Kingdoms, writing adventures for that. And I guess that is it.
Awesome.
Sorry,
Jen.
I'm super bad at intros.
Hi, I'm Jen Adcock. I'm the new kid on the block, having been designing for about 6 years. I started in 5e doing adventure design for kids and kid-friendly games. And I have sort of moved all over the place. I do a little bit of everything, but my most recent project you may have heard of, we just did the Kickstarter for The Price of Coal, a story game about the West Virginia Coal Wars. So that is coming next year.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's get started. First thing first, I think what we're going to do is we're going to set up a definition. So there's kind of three terms we want people to be aware of just to kind of head off any kind of discussion about it at the beginning. So we're going to talk about a collaborative game, a directed game, and collaboration. A collaborative game is, and versus a directed game, is where does the authority lie? In a directed game, you have a director, whatever that's called, an archivist, a GM, a DM, MC. They're a person whose responsibility is to be driving the narrative, right? With the players, there can be collaboration in that process, but there's still a person whose job is that's their responsibility. In a collaborative game, that person doesn't exist. It tends to be shared. Even if there's a facilitator, it's still the facilitator's job to get the other people to do that collaboration work rather than do that. So when we talk about collaborative or directed, we talk about where the authority lies, and collaboration can exist in both. So we're going to talk about that right now. So what about the opening thoughts about collaboration and collaboration inside directed games? Quinn, what do you think about it, just kind of in a general sense?
I think the like this tradition of sort of RPG sort of is in that like the directed games, and I think that's more sort of they're more oppositional kind of stance, and so we're generating the game through opposition. It's like, oh, like, you want to do that? No, you can't, because I have this, right? It's sort of like a conversational speed Yu-Gi-Oh kind of like, going back and forth. Yeah, here I've got my trap card, right? And then the story sort of generated through that. And so I tend to see that think of it as sort of collaboration is not as sort of much of a go-to in many directed games, but notably, like we were just sort of talking about beforehand, like something like Apocalypse World. One of the many innovations that it sort of brought into the space for directed games was this sort of collaborative sense. It's like a directed game, but there are these places where we share responsibility for sort of seeing what's there and what's happening. You're sort of playing to find out, as it were.
Right. And Jen, so how do you feel about like adding? Is there anything to add to that, or like how we're moving towards this? Or?
I would definitely agree that there is that more oppositional aspect in sort of your traditional directed game, but I think what a lot of people miss is that the collaboration in that format, I think it comes in the form of negotiation. And negotiation is absolutely a form of collaboration. It might be more of an oppositional form where the player says, all right, I'm going to go into this store and find a +3 magic sword. And the DM's like, maybe a +1, where you get that sort of push and pull. And some people prefer that as their preferred mode of collaboration. Others may not. But I think a lot of people see negotiation and they think, oh, we're not actually collaborating because we have different aims, but you are working together to get to that point of this suits both of us.
I mean, and like, I think, a lot of like OSR games, I think kind of work by that sort of sense of negotiation, right? Like of kind of, and that negotiation is actually helping like establish kind of like stuff like physics, like, well, no, I can climb over here and do that, like, oh, but and sort of what can I do, like what's possible, and then once you've done that a few times, you've now like defined things not just for what you did but for the fiction and stuff in general.
See, that's interesting because I don't have much sight into the OSR space. So hearing that kind of thing is really interesting to me because, just even you said, Jen, thinking of negotiation as a form of collaboration. Because I know when a lot of people talk about it, they're not seeing it as that. You said they're seeing it as still antagonistic. Right. So I think it's really good. And but when we talk about collaboration, then either then going from a negotiation sense or a more kind of collectivist sense, how do you kind of implement either one of those in your design, Jen, when you think about how when you create games?
So one of the things that I have been really drawn to is sort of very clearly delineating spaces of who has say over what. Even in a fully collaborative game without a director role, you, the player, you always have final say over what happens to your character. That's something that's always very important to me to delineate very clearly. I've been in too many bad games where someone is like, I'm going to shoot your character. And I'm like, wait, what? Where is what? No, please don't. But to me, and that is, I think also it ties into safety as well. Collaboration as a safety tool. So for me, it is those sort of spheres of where do you have say versus where do you need to sort of step back or work with others.
And even in a directed space, I think that's an important thing to have too, because even in a negotiation kind of style, you want to make sure that there is that kind of way forward, because otherwise you get the I want this, I want that. Well, I refuse to budge. Well, I refuse to budge, and then you're at an impasse.
And then Quinn, no one's having fun.
But then no one's having fun. But it goes back to the same point you had before of like, I shoot your character. It's like, wait, where did this come from? I'm not, like you're not in a good space. So Quinn, what about you in a directed game? How do you think about designing rules and processes kind of for collaboration inside a directed game?
Well, one of my favorite tools and kind of ways to think of it is what I call like cut the cake, right? I get to like the fairest way to sort of like evenly divide a cake is like I cut it like in half, right? And you get to pick the piece, right? So if I cut off like 1/3 of the slice, well, you're going to take the other 2/3, right? So it behooves me to do something that is going to work. Like no matter how I cut it, is going to work out for me and for you, and how that like works into a sort of a design sense is like so we'll go to the you shoot my character, right? Instead of like you get the power, you make a mechanic such that you get the power to say, I shoot, like I have a gun and I can point my gun at anybody, right? But then somebody else the person you get to point the gun at gets to go like, here's what happens, right? Like you get to initiate the threat, right? And it can work really well for like a director role, right? So like the director gets to do a thing, right? And it's like, okay, you're under threat, or thing is happening to you, but you get to define the sort of terms of it, right? And so we both get parts of the collaborative, like I'm cutting the cake, but you get the slice, and so we can do something cool.
Yeah, I feel that's like fate, right? When you want to end, you have a conflict, and you're like, I'm taking too much stress, and I need to I need to end this, right? And that becomes that same kind of little bit of idea there. I like that too, just because I love that analogy of cut the cake. Because also what I love is when you think you're cutting the cake, cut the cake evenly, or cutting the cake in someone's favor, because you're like, I really want this to happen, and they still choose the other half, and you're like, I didn't expect you to take that part. I wanted you to take this part. That's why I ended up picking.
Right, because and that's the thing that's cool too, is that because it happens like so much more often than you think. You think you're like controlling it, but then it's still this element of surprise because you don't really know what the person wants, or the person knows that you want that, and then they're like, haha, right? They pull out their crap card again. I'm gonna keep running to Yu-Gi-Oh, I think, here, but like that there's even in just that simple sort of decision of sort of how to cut it and how to take it, there's like a lot of opportunities for players to surprise and sort of do interesting stuff.
No, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, it's some good ideas on how to design rules and processes. But the thing that we also talked about earlier too, that this big thing is how do transmitting these ideas? How do you write them? How do you communicate these ideas is more important in some ways than the idea itself. Because you can have a good idea, but if people don't understand it, then it's not going to be useful. Quinn, for you, how do you write them so that they're clear? And again, we're dealing in a directed space right now. I mean, this could also apply to collaborative spaces as well.
I mean, I think for a directed space, I guess my first concern is always to be idiomatic for like a rule. Like if I'm most often for me, when I'm making these sort of mechanics, I'm sort of working in someone else's house for like their directed game. So I need to respect the idioms of whatever that sort of thing is. Of making an apocalypse world game, I'm using sort of idioms of moves and things like that. If I'm making like a Pathfinder D&D thing, those idioms of AC, armor class, blah blah blah. So finding their idioms, right? And then within those idioms, giving making sure you're delineating roles in the process, right? Like, okay, so like in this thing, you are doing, this person is doing this and this person is doing that, right? And then think of how you can communicate what the conversation is going to be like. Like a lot of times when I design role-playing game mechanics, I actually pretend to talk it like I was at the table and like, okay, how is this going to sound like, right? Like, are they going to be like, oh, well, I am saying this and then that, and then so once you have that conversation played out, just try and turn that into sort of a process and write that out. I think I'm communicating that clearly, but
yeah, no, I got it. Jen, what about you?
Yeah. For me, one of the things that I really like, so because I love to steal from other games, I have totally stolen the GM principles and agendas from PBTA for non-PBTA games, just because I think having a very clear list for a facilitator or director to fall back on helps so much, just to be able to be like, here is your checklist of what you should be thinking about at any given time, and always having on there being a fan of the characters and asking them questions. A bit before our chat started, we were talking a little bit about questions as such a powerful tool for collaboration. And I always like to stress that for people is ask each other questions. Be curious about what each other are thinking. Be curious about your characters' inner worlds. And that goes kind of double, I think, in a directed game where it ends up so easy to focus on your character's interactions with the world or the world's interactions with the group as a whole. That you can very easily accidentally end up not considering sort of the inner world of all of the characters.
And here's a question. How do you help design for play in a directed space for collaboration? Because we talk a lot about the GM, DM, the director, having all these tools. How do we write to let the players know it's okay to be collaborative in this kind of way? right? Because we talk so much about the director, again, because it's such an important role, because it's directing the action, it's doing all, it has all this extra responsibility. They're another player, right? They're a part of the game, but they have different responsibilities, right? And so we try to give them all these tools, but then, are we neglecting the player side to say, hey, here are some tools for you as a player?
I mean,
yeah, that's always an interesting one. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you go. Keep going.
I always like to stress that at any time, if a player is stuck or something, or they don't know what to do next, or they're kind of like, I don't know about these things, is asking each other for suggestions. And I like to put those reminders front and center everywhere. Because even if another player is maybe not in a certain scene, or something is not as central to their character or whatever, they can still have suggestions and thoughts as a player. I mean, we always do. And you can say, oh, I'm really not sure what my character might do next, but another player may still have input to that. And you can choose to accept or reject that. That's always important to note when you're telling people to ask for suggestions, is don't forget, you can reject any suggestions you get. That's cool. But reminding people that they don't have to come up with everything themselves is really important.
Yeah, like giving people the sort of, because there's that notion of like creative fatigue, right? And that sometimes, for some players, the reason that they're in the directed game is that it takes off a certain creative burden from them, right?
Yeah.
And so that they're just like, they're more reactive to what's happening, and so when you add that sort of openness and collaboration back into space, it sort of is not what they want, right? And they're like, no, like don't let me decide, right? It's like hot potato.
You tell me.
Yeah, like no,
Yep,
I'm here. I'm here because
absolutely.
you are doing it, and so making sure that like I like to sort of, in allowing for that, try and make sure that there's like almost like a GM override. It's like, oh, the player can have input, or the GM can kind of, the player can like kind of forego it, and then the GM's like, okay, cool, right? And then generally the director is going to be probably a person who's got a ton of these ideas anyways, and they're just going to kind of keep going with that.
So I guess I had a thought, and I did something on my desk, and I completely blew it out of my mind. But yeah, because we talk about the fatigue. We talk about oh, right, that's what it was. It was, how do you do we have ideas on how we want to make sure? Because the negotiated thing just blew my mind. Sorry, Jen, you just literally took my mind. I had that moment.
That's good.
Right. So, but how do we kind of create that space to let people know that is okay to negotiate, right? I mean, is it in the same methods? Because you don't really ask. I mean, you can ask questions in negotiation. What do you want? What are you looking for? Right. But then they tell you, and what's kind of the next steps. So when we talk about like, more, I'm going to use confrontational, even though negotiation is has a connotation. When we talk about negotiation, we talk about, I have what I want, and I'm trying to get the best of thing for me, and you're trying to get the best thing for you, and it feels confrontational, even though you said it's still a form of collaboration. Is there a way to kind of promote that idea of, yes, it can still be that and still be collaborative when we kind of create these rules, when we talk about these design spaces? Jen, do you have a thought on that one, or just, and then?
What I kind of think, and it's one of those things where I think the connotations in our language can sort of trip us up. The idea of compromise, it always sort of implies, to me at least, that both parties or one party is sort of losing something in the negotiation. But we don't really have a good equivalent in English that implies that, you've reached the solution that makes everyone happy and no one loses anything. But there has to be a way, I think, and maybe we still need to find it, to remind people that is the real goal, is that negotiation does not have to result in anyone losing anything. That it can bring about new surprises in ways that maybe neither party of the negotiation expected. And I think spelling that out can be tricky. I'm always in favor, honestly, of just the blunt approach. Just say it. Just say it. That's one of those things where I think we were talking earlier about on your previous panel about the artful language, the evocative language versus the clear and concise language. And that's one of those areas where I think being really clear and concise is just so key and so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
I think in thinking of it, like I've never kind of put negotiation sort of formally in a game, but like how I just thinking roughly how I would like tackle something like that, because it is really is a really great insight, Jen. I just want to plus one that. But then, but like sort of putting that into like how I would sort of do it in a game is like when I want to. I find when I want to get kind of atypical conversations in the game, it's worth putting like rituals of like conversation in the game, sort of like, okay, so like you could, for this thing, here is like a way to talk about like when you want to do this thing that is basically going to be a negotiation, here is like a process for doing it, like kind of like put a thing on the table, depending on the thing, you could make it like flavorful in game, like I command of thee, blah blah blah, right? Like you could sort of you can make it like you can make it like a fictional kind of thing, and basically conversational tools are ones that allow people who aren't normally going to be in that space or have that to like, if by just using these tools, by using some of this language and this process, I can do these things that I wouldn't naturally do, and sort of putting those in the game as something that people can sort of borrow, right? It's like a sort of like a conversation suit they can put on and then take off and then go back to their normal thing.
I love that.
Because some people won't negotiate because they just don't want to create kind of
it's not in their nature,
right? But people love to put on sort of these roles and these suits. I mean, this is what our games are all about, right? And then and then if you give them armor, then if you give them sort of this suit, this sort of thing that they're like, hey, I'm not negotiating, right? It's I'm engaging this mechanic for my character that is essentially negotiating, but then I'm out of it, and then I'm back to me.
I love the term conversational suit. I'm just gonna
so good. Like, I'm stealing it.
Right? Conversational suit is fantastic. But I love that. I love that idea of virtualization of language. I love that idea of saying, hey, because there's the two ends of that. There's people who don't want to negotiate because they don't want to. They feel it's a conflict, and those people who will always negotiate everything. Right? Because they are trying to eke out every single ounce of advantage that they can.
Right. And if you have a good ritual, if you have a good ritual, you can depower the people who that's their default. Like you can tone them down and lift the other people
and
up.
Bring everyone else up. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. Like, no, it's fantastic. It's exactly. I'm glad when you two say it, because I it's. I love that. I love that kind of thing. So we had some examples of kind of directed games where this kind of exists. I think we talked about games with cooperative world building aspects. That's one sense of collaboration inside a directed game. Games that ask players questions. Tis the season. So Epi, we're mentioning Dread.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, right? But yeah, like that questionnaire is such a collaborative bit of world building, because you give people that questionnaire and they're fantastically leading questions that you throw on there, and you just watch the players just explode the world around you. We talked about Apocalypse World, right? When you mentioned it, and we talked about asking players questions, being fan of the players and asking questions, but also Quinn, you would talk about moves too, right? Like it's just letting you the opportunity to do that, where we were talking about the moves giving players the option of what is going to happen, right? I can choose, all these kind of things. I mean, going back to Epi, Swords of the Master, right? Wolf Spell is one of my most favorite games ever, only because, like, two reasons. One, because it looks metal with the thing, but also...
It really does.
It really does. I love it so much. But also...
Really great.
right? Because it has that kind of thing where it's here are your, roll, choose your options of what happens.
Right.
Yeah, so I think those are some fantastic examples we had. But let's kind of move slightly over. Actually, let's do the first. Before we finish with directed games, Mickey, are there any questions in the chat that we could maybe kind of, if they're hitting on directed games, we could kind of use, or? That's okay. Perfectly fine. So let's move on to collaborative games. So a big thing about collaborative games, role-playing games, board games, is that how do you create, what's your source of tension? So Quinn, for you, what is your favorite kind of source of tension?
My favorite source of tension in like collaborative games is like so there's like the randomness kind of thing of like, okay, we like kind of put things in a black box, like we choose we're going to make a bunch of elements, right, and then we're going to sort of like put them in a grinder and like a randomizer, and then we're not sure how, we know what's in there, but we don't know how it's going to come out or what's going to sort of happen
Mm-hmm.
to it. And so we were like putting them in the funnel and then doing that. I think that is probably like one of my favorite ones overall, although there are a lot of other great ones.
Yeah, no, I'm down with that chart. The Cybergen plot path was one of the best things Artel ever did, which was roll a dice. Hey, this is the thing. Does it happen over here? What's going on? Right? Like, it was fantastic. I remember ages ago that people liked it so much that all the Cyberpunk fans wanted it, and so they created a plot path for Cyberpunk in Listen Up, You Primitive Screwheads, because they're like, well, everyone's wants this so bad. Here you go. Jen, what about you?
For me, I think there are sort of two things that I tend to fall back on. One is ticking clocks and timers. Anytime you can introduce a ticking clock, the tension just ratchets up inherently. And we even feel that in real life. The other thing that I always go to is relationships and relationship mechanics. Anytime that you can sort of define these characters want different things, or they want the same thing, but they can't both have it. I think probably every single one of my first drafts, and it usually gets cut by the final version of the game, everyone just has a slot on the character sheet that's just secret and goal. Just these are the two things you need to drive tension. Your character needs a secret and a goal. And usually I find better ways around that, but those are fair starting points.
No, that works. I liked it a lot. Because again, the other thing I think for me you talked about is I love questions. I do love questions. I love leading questions, searching questions. There's all different types of questions you can have, and they do different things. And Quinn, you made a really good point. I really would like you to go into it about, say, like the difference between, say, something like For the Queen, where you ask questions, and Fiasco, which kind of has these things that you build these relationships out of.
Yeah.
But there seemed to be like a directional thing about that. If you wanted to go into that, I'd love to.
Yeah. I mean, like I would boil it down to sort of like two ends, like prompts and elements, right? And then sort of going in sort of like from inside to outside, right? So like elements are kind of things, like elements are sort of inside. Okay, here's what constitutes like my character, the world, the fiction, everything. Here are the things in the world, right? And so if we give you elements from a design standpoint, like in Fiasco, right? Fiasco is a lot of giving you elements, right? And then you move it towards, right? Like you start to go, how are these elements going to get used, right? And then that's sort of where the game goes, right? Take these elements, go forth, and go outside, right? And then outside is kind of like the what happens, and that's where sort of when you have prompts, right? When you're asking questions like what is this thing, right? And the only way to answer, like if assuming the question is open enough, right? The only way to answer a question is to move in, right? And to define elements, right? So like you have For the Queen, right, which is like just a brilliantly sort of balanced set of like leading questions, right? Like, when did you last displease the queen? Well, you're going to have to define a bunch of stuff on the inside to sort of get that well sussed out, and people are going to ask you other follow-up things, and you're going to build a lot of things just to answer that one question. And so yeah, like that, I feel like those are like the kind of main sort of ends of that kind of form of collaboration.
So Jen, I got a question for you. Are these things words are escaping me, but basically, are these things mutually exclusive, or are these things you can incorporate together, or should you focus more one on the other, or like, because like they have different goals, right? They have
It's
different
true.
goals. So
I would say there's always ways for things to be combined. But if you just sort of keep piling things on top of each other, you end up without a clear path to a satisfying resolution, which I think a lot of times when we're playing games, especially collaborative games, we all might see sort of our own different paths to a satisfying conclusion, but we all have that shared goal that we want to get to a satisfying conclusion. And I'm specifically saying satisfying as opposed to like a happy ending, because there's definitely games where we don't want that at all.
No.
But getting to a resolution, as opposed to just, I guess we ran out of time and everything blew up.
My go-to end of a con game. I'm sorry, you ran out of time. Everything exploded. But we're playing.
Sorry,
we're
it's
playing
4 p.m. We gotta go.
We have to go. Secretly, there was an evil genius, and everything's exploded. Thanks for coming.
Yep. Rocks fall, everyone dies.
Well, and I will say too, if you focus, what I found is if you focus on any one of those things and then continue it long enough, it becomes like eventually like there is a directional element to it. And so if you ask enough questions, right, like and for the queen, this one of the things I love playing, like introducing people to our role playing games with it, is because there's always this beautiful point where you've answered so many questions and you've established so much stuff about the world, right? And you get into this thing, so you're like inside the world, you've gotten all this stuff, and now it's like now we're calling back things that like we're 10 questions in, and you're like, oh, and you were talking about that thing, and now we're using elements, and now we're driving, like the questions are kind of like almost unimportant because we already kind of have this sense of like where things
You've
going,
set
and
the engine in motion,
right, and now we're driving off of elements, and now we're kind of going, and we're now going back outside, and we're the questions are just giving us an excuse to say how this world's going. And then similarly in Fiasco, you get to this part where you've got everything set in motion, and now it's just like, oh, what's going to happen? And like, oh, all this stuff is crazy, where's it all going to fall? And now we've got sort of, we're on the outside asking kind of questions, so they like it's fluid, I think.
It's like a sine wave.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of does this
Right.
thing where it keeps going up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. So let's talk about resolutions. Let's talk about, because again, when we talk about a collaborative game, when we have a directed game, we know who is providing the resolution for you, right? Even if you're working in a collaboration space, it's the director that still says, okay, you have swung your sword enough, the thing is dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right? How do you reach that kind of that resolution in your collaborative design?
One thing I think is super important with that is not keeping secrets from other players. Like, even with, things only your character knows, you as a player should still tell each other that. And I think that games should specifically tell people to do that. I think especially when you have players who are more used to traditional spaces and directed games where it might be like, I'm going to hold on to this secret until its most dramatic moment for reveal, because the director is going to provide that moment for me because they and I are the only one who knows. Whereas with a group space with collaboration, there's no director waiting to step in and say, okay, Jen, here's your moment to do your big secret reveal. But I can say, okay, John, Quinn, so my character knows this. How can we build to a scene where this gets revealed to your characters?
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And the best advice is to, not keep secrets.
Mhm.
Um,
And also like rolling back to a thing too, that notion of that separation of sort of players from characters, right, is acknowledging players as an audience, right, is one of the cool things about role-playing games, that we're playing, we're making the thing, but we're also watching the thing at the same time,
Hmm.
right? And so then it's like, and then that player as audience role is also another source of tension, right? Because we know things that the characters don't know, and we get to, like, we've all had those sort of things in games where we're just all going like, oh my god, there's going to be a train wreck, right? And
right.
and driving our
Push it
characters through this,
towards the train
right? You're
wreck.
just like, no, right? Like, got time to leave the nest, right? And
Yeah.
and watch it blow up.
Yeah, no, I remember running a game at a convention and someone's like, "Oh, I don't want to do this to your character." I'm like, "No, no, do it. Do it.
Please
Destroy
do.
him
Yeah, yeah.
emotionally, please." Okay. So then we talked about tension and we talked about kind of moving towards resolution. We talked about this in directed games. How do you write this in a collaborative game? Because in a directed game, to use to use D&D as the example, right? You have the player's book, and this is what they're supposed to read, and then you have the DM's guide, which is the DM's supposed to be read, and the player's guide, and all the other
Mhm,
stuff, right? Where that we're used to as players
mhm,
having to understand a fraction. I mean, again, there's mastery, there's rules master, there's all that
mhm,
kind of stuff, but we've had to understand a fraction of what the full scope of everything is. You kind of hopefully want everyone to have, again, there's always going to be levels. People are going to have a different understanding level, but everyone have a
Right.
greater understanding of how the game works. So how do you write that into your game? How do you write that into your book, your game, your PDF, whatever final product it is? How do you write that into that?
One of the things we ran into with the price of coal, and I'm very grateful that I was stopped from doing it the way that I had been doing it. I had written the game in such a way that it worked really well if you were already familiar with the games I was basing it on.
Mm,
I had not written it with the assumption of a brand new player or someone who's only played a traditional directed game and welcoming them into that space. Um, and then having to look at it from that perspective of, okay, what if I've never played a story game before? What if I've never played a collaborative game where I have this kind of narrative control? And I think just having that sort of imaginary, what if it's this player's first RPG? It's unlikely that it would be, I think, realistically. But what if it was? Having that imaginary player is really good in mind.
mhm. I When I make collaborative, kind of like collaborative space games, I like to think of them as kind of scripts. So like literally, like I want to be sort of, I don't want to, obviously I'm not trying to tell people exactly what to say at all times, but whenever I can, it's like, hey, in this moment, say this thing, right? And in this moment, like, in community radio, there are like kind of like cues to like swap between parts, like, okay, like, welcome, like you're supposed to have sort of like a radio call, like, there's a part where you switch between two modes, where it's like one where this like kind of like you create this sort of zany improv kind of slice of life scene, and in this weird town, and then another one you sort of do a radio report. Somebody is like the radio DJ on it, and so there's like this thing where you get like a call sign for it, and so what mode you're in when the radio's like, oh, welcome to like ZRQ, blah blah blah, public, community radio, right? And then these sort of uh, and then to communicate the rules in that way, like, hey, do this, like, try and be uh, to avoid assumptions and stuff like that for myself. I try and be literal, right? And sort of
Mhm.
like, and very sort of process driven, like, you're going to do this and you're going to do that, and then you usually in editing you then can break it up and go into guidance and things like that. But like if that first path is like as literal as you can make it, that helps. I find that helps communicate the expectations and play.
I do love scripts, and one of the games that first taught me that was Dialect, actually, because it has that initial read aloud prompt of just to get everyone on the page of what this game is and is not about. But then as you transition through the different stages of the game, you also have each next piece that you read out loud, just to make sure that everyone is on board with the changes that have taken place in the world over time.
Mm.
And I think that's super cool. I think scripts are great.
Mm.
I think a lot of people don't like scripts because
Mm.
they're like, don't tell me what to say. But I find them so helpful to fall back on personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Well,
and especially, oh, sorry, you gonna say?
no. You go.
And especially if the scripts are things that are like defining kind of you know, the shape of the thing, but not like the nature of the thing, right? Like, the script is
Mm,
basically, okay, we're going to go here, like For the Queen basically opens up with a script to tell you everything. Like, okay, we're going to
yeah.
do this, we're going to do that, here's what's happening, right? Blah, 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 and go, right? It doesn't tell you what the elements need to be, but there is just, here's how we're going to proceed.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome because I'm not one to use scripts, right? And I think I should more.
Mm.
And I think this has been fantastic because it's been good to hear like the utility of them and where, because for me, my problem is I'm very verbose. So when I'm writing, I'm like, oh, I didn't write a script. I wrote a screenplay. Right. Because I'm sure you want to keep them to a certain particular length. You don't want them to get too long because then it's like, it goes back to even adventure writing where you're like, if your text that you have to read the players is a page, they have tuned out.
Mm.
Right. And so I think that's
Mhm.
just really interesting there too. So other thing I just wanted to say, so what is for you the most important thing for you when you design? And does this particularly done in a collaborative game?
Like in terms of just fostering collaboration,
Sure.
or
Fostering collaboration when you're specifically writing a thing, what's one thing you find yourself going back to again and again and again and again and again?
I really like it's like two things.
Mm.
I like creating spaces for people to feel safe to create, right? When not to get on too big of a soapbox, but like one of the appeals of RPGs is that there aren't like really like a ton of great spaces in our lives that we can just sort of like make up any old thing, right? Like sort of like free of judgment, or like, oh, you didn't make a perfect thing. Well, I'm gonna, I don't know, leave nasty comments or something like that, just to be able to sort of create and like use your imagination, right? And so like I like to make games where it's just like, cool, like just use your imagination, right? And use it, and then we're going to, the processes and stuff in the game will help you do something cool with it, right? Like you don't have to, imagine the whole thing, right? Like you insert something, and then we have a process for creating, and usually using other people's support at the kind of table. Like I had a old game, Five Fires, that where I use sort of like a thing for making art, that for making art, which was like a collaborative process. Like one person, the artist, sort of makes things for an audience, and then the audience sort of, um, as the other players, sort of gives other elements of it. And so then at the end of it, you have this sort of collaboratively created thing off of your initial design. And that is the kind of thing I keep sort of coming back to in my design. It's like, how can you take a seed, and safely create it, and then sort of spin that into something really cool at the table. So I guess that was supposed to be my first thing, but that really like incorporates like my second thing of sort of collaboratively making it something new.
Hmm.
And I think that's actually a great segue into my thing, because I was thinking that this is something that I have learned more recently and am going to go back to every time now because I can't stop thinking about it, is the idea that good collaboration requires a degree of vulnerability.
Mm.
Especially we live in this world where you are not often encouraged to use your imagination and be vulnerable and be free about what you want. And maybe we have our regular gaming groups, or we are used to opening up ourselves in play and things like that. But there's always people who are less comfortable with that. There are people who are playing with each other for the first time and maybe are not as able to open up or as willing to open up. And so providing scaffolding through, I think, safety tools, honestly, legitimately, as to say, this is a space where you can be vulnerable, is something that I hadn't seen it. Just because to me, it doesn't necessarily always feel it. I'm just used to being like, okay, so we're going to sit down at this table and I'm going to bleed all over it. But remembering and reminding myself that I am asking of vulnerability from my players and how can I protect them?
No.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good point you make. It's like, I think as designers, we take for granted that opening ourselves up to be creative is a skill, right? It's like kind of like one of our core skills is that we sort of opening up, and that everyone has access to that skill, but not everyone has cultivated that skill to the same degree.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about it a little more, because we've got some time still, and I was going to ask examples of things you like, but I really like this concept, this idea of collaboration as vulnerability. If we can just kind of unpack that a little bit more, right? So like, I guess the big question is in what do you think are the ways that it makes us vulnerable, right? Because we can be vulnerable in so many different ways, right? What in particular? What kind of vulnerability kind of openings is it? Kind of like, I know this, and this, right? Not to oversimplify it, but like to a little bit, right?
For me, a lot of it comes down to anytime that you want something, there is kind of an innate vulnerability to that, because there is a chance that you are not going to get what you want. And not to be all, no man is an island, but we are taught a lot of times in our current culture that wanting things and needing things makes you weak. And this is an awful, terrible idea. But we all want things when we're gaming. We all want certain things out of the experience. And sometimes even just expressing that desire, even if it's just to 3 or 4 of your buddies who you hang out with every week, can be revealing. And I think it's that revelation that is the vulnerability, where you are saying, no, it's important to me that this character gets a happy ending because I'm just having the worst week and I need this to happen. And trusting that everyone else is going to help you do that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is sort of like, piggybacking off what you're saying, Jen, is like that wanting is then opening you up for rejection, right? And a lot of people are trying to drive away from that rejection. And, speaking from a play experience, right? Because a lot of we can communicate as designers ways to sort of make things safer and things, but like a lot of this happens at the table, but when I'm playing, like when I find like my biggest job these days as a GM is really just to make people like feel like they won't be rejected, right? Like they can come up with something, right? And I will find a way to incorporate it and make it work, right? And then the only thing that really I just will require of them is that they let me feel free to, like in a directed experience, let me be able to sort of prune it a bit, right? Like I will get the core right in there, but I might need to like work around and do that, and that when you make people feel that they won't be rejected, that they start to open up in like pretty amazing ways, honestly.
I had a fun thought recently because I was thinking about a fairy tale game where GMs doesn't stand for game master. It's you're the godmother. You are the fairy godmother, and you need the players to be honest with you about what they're wishing for so that you can grant that to them.
Okay, where's your newsletter? I'd like to sign up for this newsletter.
It's okay. It takes me forever to make games, so this game won't come out till 2029.
Hey, welcome to Team Takes Forever to Make Games. I'm good with that.
I'm also on that team.
Right.
Slow and steady wins the race.
But yeah, I think it goes back to something even like moves, right? About even in because the game I'm working on is a Powered by the Apocalypse collaborative game, right? There is no MC, there's nothing there. And what helps with moves in that regard is that it provides you the framework to say, okay, well, you want this thing to happen. Here is the structure. It's almost, again, going to ritual, right? Here is the structure by which you do it. You make the roll and you find out how well the outcome is. Okay, the outcome is poor. Okay, it's great. Here's your options. It's moderate. Here are your options. And here are the consequences. At the bottom, let's all talk about what happened. Let's all decide as a group what bad outcome, even if you get what you want. But I love that part of the 6 or less. It's like, yes, you can get the thing. The cost is now astronomical. How much do you want the thing? Right. And I think that kind of provides that. In fact, I may even go back now and just say, just do that. Just say you can get the thing, but here's the astronomical cost that comes with it. And I think that helps deal with that kind of vulnerability because you know the ground rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something we can write in our collaborative games, not moves, right? Specifically, right? But writing some degree of certainty, not necessarily of what the outcome or the element is, but the process to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're in,
Well, Quinn, you want to have a comment, and then Jay have a comment, and then we have a question in the queue, and we'll take it.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think what you're talking about there is sort of we're moving away from rejection to letting go, right? It's one thing for us to reject what you want to do. It's another thing if you decide it's not worth it, right? And you let go, right?
Yes.
Because we've set up, okay, so here, you want this thing, but here's the ways that you can get it, right? Do you want it? And then you can be like, sure, and I'll blow up the world in the way, right? And then you get to tell a cool story about that, right? And it just moves things forward because when people are afraid of that rejection, they just the whole game shrivels up. But it's fun to watch.
I think that's sort of where I was thinking about it too, was giving everyone the choice. Choices are always one of the juiciest spaces to be in when you want both things. When there's no carrot or stick necessarily, it's just two carrots and you can't have them both.
It's fantastic. Okay, so we have a question in the chat, and then I think we'll probably take that and then wrap it up.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question that we heard and try to pare it down because it was fairly long. The key part there is how do you write the tension between, I'm guessing, and this is in a directed space, the collaboration between the director and the players without overwhelming players who are, again, not used to that, or even in a collaborative game. I guess it makes sense. How do you write so that, because again, most people are coming from that directed style. How do we handle that so we're not overwhelming these people with, oh my God, I have to do all this stuff. I flip table, I'm out. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, I think this comes back, actually circling back to something Quinn said towards the beginning about more reactive players. There are some players who just want that more reactive role as opposed to a proactive role in world building and scene building and things like that. And I think one way you can do that is giving them the say over how much of the world building or scene building they're doing. That you could say, delegate that to other players who might be more invested in that role. You might ask them 1 or 2 questions, but then let them feed answers from the rest of the table is a definite possibility.
Yeah, and another one too is depending on what the nature of the sort of space or mechanic is to be able to provide like default actions, like if there's like a sort of default like table that you can roll on. It's like, hey, like pick something or roll here, right? And then you can sort of shunt you can sort of turn the choice into randomness, which still sort of gives that sort of room for surprise, but then takes that creative pressure off them.
Yeah.
Lists. A random table is really just a list,
Yeah,
because you can
basically.
make any list a random table just by rolling a die. But giving that option of being like, well, I'm going to look at these 5 options, be like, I like number 2, or I'm going to let the fates decide. That can also be very empowering.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, I think we're gonna we have a little bit of 6 minutes left. So I'm gonna ask everyone for what's their kind of like their favorite collaborative game and what they like the most about it.
I'm gonna go with Before the Queen. I mean, I play that one just a lot, and with like established players, not established players, and it's one of these themes that like cuts like right to the core of what we do in the space, and it's so easy to like explain. Like even people were like, "Oh my god, I've never done." And you're like, "Nope, just we're gonna we're gonna be 2 questions in, and you're gonna sound like you've been like doing storytelling games for like your whole life, right?" And it is always the case. I've never seen it be different. Yeah, I just like it sculpts that collaborative space.
My answer is actually, it's funny. So I'm going to go with The Quiet Year. But part of the reason I love that game is the reason that on the surface, on maybe an initial read or initial play, that it seems to reject collaboration in some very interesting ways, where, on your turn, you add something to the map and others do not have input into that. They cannot stop you. And having the specific, I believe they call it the conversation in that, where everyone gets to say one thing. This is your one input into this issue. And that is all you get to say on it. And I think having those constraints, because it's always more fun to bounce off of constraints, I think. I think it does that in some really juicy ways.
I'm going to cheat and not give you a collaborative game. I'm going to give you Worldwide Wrestling. Because Worldwide Wrestling, I think, is amazing in regards to, it's still a directed game. There's still a creative. But creative does actually very little in the game, right? What happens is that when you have 2 characters who are wrestling each other, it's up to them to tell the story, and creative goes, "Oh, by the way, you win," and then like leaves. It's absolutely, and even then, whatever creative decides, you don't have to stick to. You can force a different ending. You can do all this kind of stuff. But what happens is all the storytelling happens between, like you could literally almost just flip a coin, right? Or like do something rather than have a creative there, and you could still work. I think there's ways to make it collaborative that would be fantastic, but there's so much interaction, because if you're not wrestling, then you're being the announcer, or you're part of the crowd, or like the game actively kind of like, I really want to play a roller wrestling game with like 10 people. Right?
Oh, that would be awesome.
Right? Because you have all these different wrestlers and you have a big match and a big show, but then you actually have like 8 people in the crowd doing chants, and you have like the 2 announcers, and you have the ring, the referee, and like all this. You have people taking on those roles and constantly shifting. And so I think it would be fantastic and amazing. And I think it just kind of, the way it's structured fits a collaborative play environment so well that I love Worldwide Wrestling. It's one of my most favorite games ever. I mean, second to that would be Five Fires, which is what Quinn has previously put. but we'll go there another time. With that, we have 2 minutes left. So Jen, Quinn, I'll start with you, Quinn. Where can people find your stuff? Where can they find you online? What are you working on?
They can find me online at QH_Murphy on Twitter, and thoughtcrimegames.net. And right now, working on adventure set in the Iron Kingdoms, a world of War Machine, and also doing some Pathfinder stuff. I just published Spoken on the Song Wind, which is part of the Strength of Thousands adventure path. It's a really cool adventure path. You check it out. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Jen, how about you?
You can find me on Twitter at JenCatWrites, JenKatWrites. I'm sorry I never shut up. I am on Twitter all the time. I'm mostly working on fulfilling the price of coal right now. I have a couple of other projects that I'm looking at. I've got a wrestling game, a fairy tale game, a game about knights. I don't know what I want to do next. We're just figuring it out as we go.
Awesome. And I am Jonathan Lavallee. You can find me at Firestorm Inc. with a K, INK. That pun has gotten me more problems than I'd care to count. But you can find me on Twitter, on Itch, on DriveThru, and Firestorm-Inc. INK.com is the website. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope you enjoy the last. I hope you enjoyed Metatopia, and I hope you enjoy the last few panels that you have.